The Chosen Season 4, Episode 2, Recap, Review, and Analysis. My recap, review, and analysis of The Chosen Season 4 premiere continues. I decided to do a separate post for Episode 1 and Episode 3 because they each merit their own discussion and review. Episode 2 of The Chosen Season 4 centers around the elevation of two characters, Shmuel's elevation to the Sanhedrin on account of his efforts to expose Jesus as a deceiver, and Simon's elevation to his role as Peter, on account of his confession of Jesus as the Christ and the Son of the living God, based on Matthew 16:13-20. Below, I will describe the events of the episode in greater detail and then go on to share my personal impressions and my analysis of the key themes and ideas. What happened in The Chosen Season 4, Episode 2? Episode 2 of The Chosen Season 4 has two main storylines in addition to few smaller plots: Jesus and the disciples. Episode 2 opens with a dream in which Jesus encounters John the Baptist and sees his cousin break free of his chains and depart toward a snowy mountain. Awaking from the dream, Jesus finds Andrew also awake. The two process through their grief over John and why they aren't quite as overwhelmed with sorrow as they had expected to be. Jesus points out that there's no proper way to grieve and that often the moments of greatest sadness are also the moments we laugh the most. Andrew says Jesus is a mystery, and that inspires Jesus to continue the Shiva mourning for John on the open road, John's true home. As Jesus leads the disciples toward Mount Hermon, they talk along the way. Thomas and Rama decide to ask Jesus to be Rama's witness/surrogate father in their betrothal. Jesus uses this as an opportunity to talk to the disciple about his purpose. He has not come to bring peace, but a sword and division, even within families, because the command to love God is greater than that to honor father and mother, Matthew 10:34-39. After, Rama tells Thomas that she doesn't really need a wedding gift, and he takes her at face value, prompting Simon to take him aside and explain the subtleties of communication in marriage. As the disciples near Caesarea Philippi, Mount Hermon, they begin to encounter remnants of pagan shrines to Baal, before finally reaching the gates of hell, a cultic complex outside a cave that the pagans considered an entrance into the underworld. The disciples are disgusted by all the pagan worship, particularly when they encounter goats brought in for the implied purpose of ritual bestiality. Arriving at the altar of Pan outside the gates of hell, Jesus responds to the disgust of his disciples by questioning whether they should avoid dark places out of fear or whether they should be light to them. John did not shrink back from dark places like this cave. He asked them as to who outsiders say that he is, and then questions who they say that he is. When Simon declares that he is the Christ, Jesus names him Peter, rock, and declares that he is building his church on this rock, and the gates of hell will not stand against it. He summons the disciples to be fearless in the face of evil and willing to follow him anyway, even to dark places like this. That night, as the disciples camp, Big James and John grumble and bicker about Simon's elevation to Peter. The disciples question whether Simon is now the best or chief. This prompts Matthew to go talk privately with Jesus. He doesn't understand why Jesus would elevate Simon given how cruel he has been to Matthew. Jesus acknowledges Matthew's grievance but also encourages Matthew to ask Simon to forgive him for all the hurt he inflicted as a tax collector. Matthew is hesitant, not wanting to start an argument, but Jesus insists that there can be no peace while his followers continue to hold resentment against one another. Meanwhile, back at camp, Simon Peter encourages them all to go to bed and leads them in evening prayer. The next day, John and James continue to grumble and wonder whether they could secure high positions for themselves as well. They buy pistachios at a vendor, despite Judas' concern over the finances, and Nathanael demonstrates his skill by distributing the nuts evenly between the 16 followers. Simon Peter confides in Andrew some of the self-doubt he's feeling in the wake of his lapse last season. Meanwhile, Tamar questions Matthew about how he knows what to include in his account. Prompted by Jesus, Matthew finally goes and apologizes to Simon Peter and asks for forgiveness, but Simon walks away, frustrated. That night, as Simon Peter lies in bed with Eden, unable to sleep, he thinks back to the terrible night in Season 1, Episode 4, when he railed against God as he struggled to find enough fish to pay off his debt. Getting up, he finds Jesus outside the city and questions why he should forgive Matthew after being sinned against well over 7 times. Jesus insists that he must forgive not 7, but 70 times 7, as much as needed, Matthew 18:15-20. But Simon Peter is reminded of what came of Matthew's actions, Simon's encounter with Jesus. Still, Simon struggles to accept what he must do, stomping away angrily. As morning dawns, John offers to help Thomas get a gift for Rama by bartering up from some of his mother's pastries. Simon Peter arrives and, seeing Matthew, marches up and hugs him. Forgiving him, he notes that it was all for good. an allusion to Joseph's famous line in Genesis 50:20, and commits to sticking by him to the ends of the earth. Yosef, Jairus, Shmuel, and the Sanhedrin. As Yosef dresses for the day, he recites the words of Koheleth Ecclesiastes, meditating on the fleeting nature of this world and all of its riches. His eyes fall on a key that has some mysterious meaning to him, but he quickly shuts it away. A man, Nathan, comes to seek counsel concerning his persistent and debilitating anxiety. Yosef recognizes the possibility that the man is carrying the anguish of their forefathers in his bones and offers to pray with him daily. He almost refers him to Jesus, but holds back. After the man leaves, Yosef asks Jairus how his daughter is. They can't explicitly discuss her healing lest they be overheard. And Jairus brings news that Shmuel has been promoted to the Sanhedrin and Nicodemus has been absent from it. They fear that the rumors of the feeding of the 5,000 will cause trouble. As Shmuel is fitted with new robes, honoring his membership in the Sanhedrin, he talks to Yanni about his encounter with Jesus and their time praying together. Jesus' sincerity has left him questioning his opposition. When Yanni brushes his doubts aside, Shmuel questions whether the Sanhedrin is actually concerned with improving their nation or whether they're too busy with empty posturing. At the meeting of the Sanhedrin, Rabbi Shammai welcomes Shmuel and commends him for his efforts to expose Jesus. He condemns Jesus for being a false prophet on account of his contempt for the law and his willingness to fraternize with tax collectors, women, Gentiles, and zealots. A rabbi named Shimon attempts to defend Jesus, but he is quickly shouted down. A passing comment about John's death strikes Shmuel and deepens his doubt. Meanwhile, the high priest Caiaphas addresses the Sanhedrin and insists that avoid executing the law of Moses on their own and instead entrap Jesus with questions until they can convince Rome to deal with him. They do not want Rome to see them as sowers of chaos and violence. 4 horsemen are sent throughout Israel to instruct local leaders to oppose and trap Jesus. As Shmuel continues to process the news of John's death, Yanni suggests that he be the one to find Jesus and bring him before the Sanhedrin. Shmuel realizes that he must indeed do this. One of the horsemen comes to Capernaum with news of the edict against Jesus. As Yosef and Jairus process, Yosef decides that he must leave Capernaum and use his father's wealth and influence to gain a seat at the Sanhedrin, another hint at his true identity. Using the key he was eyeing earlier, he retrieves a mysterious pouch. Quintus, Atticus, and Gaius. At the start of the episode, Quintus is having his bust sculpted when Atticus arrives and demands the latest intel on Jesus. When Quintus questions why he seems so anxious, Atticus expresses concern over how the response to Jesus' ministry may boil over into civil war. He warns Quintus that his strong tax revenue is the only thing keeping him in the good graces of Pilate and urges him to do something to contain the threat. Later, Quintus calls Gaius and the other centurion Julius. Fuming over the current state of affairs, he demands that they remove the tent city within a week. Gaius, as he leaves the meeting, bumps into Matthew. Matthew senses that Gaius is distressed over his family situation and suggests that he gets help from Jesus. Just like Gaius, he wakes up every day feeling anxious and jumbled, but is able to find peace by focusing on the one thing that matters, following Jesus. Gaius isn't interested. He advises Matthew to keep Jesus from preaching publicly during the present tension.